We'll now begin our fourth and final panel, which of course is on Russia and the world. And I think we've definitely seen during Putin's third term, and we heard as one way of compensating for the lack of reforms and the suppression of personal freedoms, the appeal to patriotism and pride in Russia's role in the world. And so what we've seen in Putin's third term is, first of all, of course, as we know, a worsening of relations with Europe and the United States after the annexation of Crimea and the launch of the war in the Donbass, but we've seen a significant improvement in relations with China, and Russia's really returned to the Middle East as the major great power there that talks to all of the major protagonists and antagonists in the region. So we're very lucky to have here a very distinguished panel of people to talk about foreign policy in Putin's fourth term. I will just briefly introduce them, and then we will begin our discussions. Sabine Fischer, who is at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, the author of many publications, and I must say, my students really enjoy your Not Frozen, very important monograph you wrote on the frozen conflicts, and you visited all of the areas where these have taken place, but writing about a lot of other different issues. Alexander Lukin, both from the Higher School of Economics and MGIMO, one of Russia's leading experts on relations with China, and his latest book was China and Russia, The New Rapprochement, which I recommend to you. Maxim Tsushkov, who has many titles, the most important of which, in my opinion, is when he was a Fulbright Fellow at Georgetown in CERES. We enjoyed having him there from 2010 to 2011. He's now with MGIMO. He's also head of the Moscow Bureau of Al-Monitor, and a consultant to various other organizations. And finally, Mikhail Troitsky, who's Dean of the School of Government and International Affairs at MGIMO. He has written widely also on US-Russian relations, on Russia in the global arena. And so let's start off with you, Sabine, to tell us something about Russia and Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Angela, and also Andy, for inviting me here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here and to speak to you all. So basically, I was asked to look into EU-Russia relations, and what I'm going to do is I will not look into Russian policy towards the EU, but really try to take a bird's eye view and talk about the relationship as such. And I would like to walk you through 5 points. I will give you some facts on the relationship, then talk a little bit about views and narratives that are shifting or drifting apart and have been for a number of years. Policies will be my third point, then the question what lies ahead, since we're talking about Putin's fourth term. And finally, I will say a few words about Germany and its relationship with Russia in the context of EU-Russia relations. So first, facts. Political relations between Russia and the EU remain severe since the annexation of Crimea and the launch of the Donbass of the war in Donbass. If you look at the relationship before 2014, it was a very dense, very intense interaction in many areas and on many levels, from working groups on, I don't remember exactly now how many different issue areas, to regular ministerial meetings in different policy areas, to 2 EU-Russia summits per year. And all this has been, or was discontinued as a reaction to the annexation of Crimea. The negotiations on a new agreement between the EU and Russia were discontinued, and so were the negotiations on visa liberalization and facilitation, which had been ongoing for a number of years before that. I'm saying all this without nostalgia because the actual, the relationship was already not in very good shape when in 2014, before the events in Ukraine in 2014, and many of these formats and discussions and dialogues and working groups were already rather devoid of substance, and particularly the summits before they were discontinued. But indeed, this was a very drastic change of the structure of the relationship in 2014. The EU, as the US, or like the US, imposed what it calls targeted restrictive measures, in other words, sanctions against individuals and organizations involved in the events in Ukraine. And then later in the summer of 2014, it imposed sectoral economic sanctions as a reaction to the escalation in the war in Donbass. And in reaction to that, Russia itself imposed mainly sanctions, and which consisted of travel bans on a number of representatives of EU member states and a ban on the import of EU agricultural products and foodstuffs. At the same time, Russia and the EU, despite the sanctions, remain important trading partners. If you look at the economic relationship, the EU remains Russia's biggest trading partner and the most important consumer of Russian energy and raw material exports. And Russia is up to today the EU's fourth largest trading partner and the most important supplier of foreign direct investment, etc. So economic relations have suffered because of the sanctions, because of economic crisis in Russia, because of the deterioration of investment climate, etc. They remain very asymmetric, but at the same time, they remain, particularly also in comparison with US-Russia economic relations, they remain rather intense. And cooperation is continuing in a variety of areas, for instance, in the area of research and innovation. So Russian universities, research institutions take active part in submit applications in the EU framework programs for research and innovation. And Russian students take part in Erasmus Mundus, for instance, and go to the EU to study at European universities with fellowships funded by the EU. But the overall result of the crisis is basically a total loss of mutual trust. As I said before, perceptions and narratives are drifting apart, and it has become very difficult to bridge those gaps and to communicate. And this brings me to my next point. I wanted to talk a little bit about these different views and narratives because I think they are very important if we try to understand where we are now in EU-Russia relations. And I wanted to give you three very quick examples of those differences between narratives, just to make clear how wide the gap is between the worldviews on both sides. And of course, I need to also make a little disclaimer, because I think it was Ambassador Teff this morning who said that behind the official Russian position, of course, there is a foreign policy debate, and I can only underline that. Yes, there is a foreign policy debate. The question is which ideas reach foreign policy making processes, but yes, there is a debate, and there is a very vivid debate on the EU side as well, and I will talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So what I will present here is really mainstream positions that inform foreign policy making on both sides. So just very briefly, if you look at how the two sides, for instance, see international politics and the world order. So from a Russian perspective, the liberal world order is in deep crisis, and the US-led Western community of states is in decline. And this is a logical consequence of the collapse of what Russia sees as an unfair post-Cold War unipolar world order, and it is also a consequence of the emergence of a multipolar world. And this world really is stable when there is an equilibrium between great powers. And the main currency in this world order is great power politics and traditional, as I said, great power politics. And you will not be surprised when I say now that Russia, of course, sees itself as one of the great powers that basically shape international relations. The EU, on the contrary, advocates exactly that liberal, rules-based order, which from an EU perspective has multilateralism as its key principle, and a global order that should ensure human rights, sustainable development, and lasting access to the global commons. And this is a quotation from the EU Global Strategy, just to give you an idea about the really wide differences between these two approaches to international politics. Very briefly on the crisis in European security. So from a Russian perspective, the current crisis, what happened in Ukraine, but also overall in European security, derives from a gradual expansion of Western, US, NATO in the first place, influence in Europe, including Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space. Since the 1990s, and the fact that Western actors not only ignored Russian interests and security interests, but indeed actually pursued and deliberately pursued a policy of containment against Russia. The EU sees Russian policy as a root cause of the current crisis. And from this perspective, it is basically Russia's claim of a sphere of interests in its neighborhood, plus an authoritarian system inside Russia that seeks domestic legitimacy through a more and more assertive foreign policy in the neighborhood, but also beyond. That is actually the problem in European security, and that created this crisis. And naturally, both sides blame one another for what happened in Ukraine from 2014. I think I'll skip the, the third point here, just to save some time. But I just wanted to highlight that we have these very different narratives and perceptions, and of course they also have a very strong impact on political approaches on both sides. And it brings me to my third point, the policies. Now, if you look at official foreign policy documents on both sides, you can see how this new rivalry that determines and that shapes EU-Russia relations is actually expressed in those foreign policy documents. Now, if you look at the foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation from 2016, it says, systemic problems in the Euro-Atlantic region that have accumulated over the last quarter century are manifested in the geopolitical expansion pursued by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the European Union, along with their refusal to begin implementation of political statements regarding the creation of a common European security and cooperation framework, have resulted in a serious crisis in the relations between Russia and Western states. And this is the first time that the EU is actually mentioned together with NATO. In previous versions of the foreign policy concept, the EU was always dealt with separately, and there was an emphasis on partnership and economic relations. The EU, on its part, in 2016 as well, published its EU Global Strategy, and the EU Global Strategy explicitly identifies the relationship with Russia as a key strategic challenge. Again, we have a departure from previous language where, if you look at, for instance, the EU security strategy of 2003, but also documents that were published later, where the relationship with Russia was always described as a strategic partnership. When you look at the policies, I would say that Russia currently applies a kind of three-pronged approach. First, it pursues what I would call a new bilateralism in its relations with the European Union. That, I mean, if you look at Russian policy before 2014, very often Russia really focused on relations with the big member states, Germany, France, and Italy, and basically often tried to bypass European institutions and smaller member states that were more critical with a view to Russia. And today, Russia very much engages with member states and political forces inside member states that are open towards Russian positions and messages, and most often these are today right-wing political forces that are Eurosceptical or anti-European. So that's the first approach. Second, Russia pushes back against EU policy, but also seeks cooperation where it suits Russian interests. And here I would say that the Russian calls for more interaction and an official formal relationship between the Eurasian Economic Union and the EU is an important point. Or, if you like, Russian calls for an EU role in post-conflict reconstruction in Syria, which is a very controversial topic between the EU and Russia currently. And the third point is that Russia continues to work to diversify its external relations. And this particularly concerns Eurasia as a whole, Asia, and China. The EU, again in 2016, adopted 5 guiding principles for its policy towards Russia. They include the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, which is a precondition for the lifting of EU sanctions, the strengthening of relations with the EU's eastern partners and other neighbors, the strengthening of the EU's resilience against Russian threats, including hybrid threats, the need for selective engagement with Russia in international crisis and conflict, and the EU's willingness to support Russian civil society and expand people-to-people contacts. So selective engagement with the Russian leadership and with Russian foreign policy, increased contacts with Russian society, and an emphasis on e-resilience and the neighborhood. So this is, again, really a change of approach. So what we've seen after 2014 really is a paradigm shift, if you like, from the idea of strategic partnership to, if you like, strategic distrust and very selective cooperation. What lies ahead? I can only echo what has been said many times before since this morning. I think this crisis is long-term. Russia is very unlikely to change its current approach before 2024 and even after, in my view. Okay, I will not go into the details. Actually, I mean, what Dan just told us, I find that very interesting. And indeed, I mean, there were some poll data published by Levada last year or early this year, I don't remember now, where you could see that the interest in foreign policy is going down. And this concerned Syria as well as Ukraine. So the big question for me is, what will be the role of foreign policy with a view to the creation creation of domestic legitimacy in the future. So this is a very important question for the future, I believe. I don't have the answer now. My assumption is that for the foreseeable future, the Russian approach towards the EU, and probably also in more general terms, is not going to change. And also, there seems to be some sort of a strategic patience in Russia, if you like, with a view to the EU, because increasing EU weakness, I think, raises the hopes in Russia that at some point the EU will just not be able to uphold certain positions in the future, and that includes the sanctions. The EU will remain inward-looking because of its internal crisis, and I think we just cannot underestimate what the migration crisis of 2015 means in that context. It really was a turning point because it strengthened right-wing populist forces, and they also challenged the EU's political approach towards Russia. It's not a priority issue at the moment, but it's part of that discussion, and it really, I mean, this was a very fundamental change. So we went from a very strong consensus on Russia policy and also sanctions in 2014-15 to new cracks emerging since 2015 in relation with the migration crisis and surrounding topics and debates. And another important factor, of course, is increasing uncertainty in Brussels, but also many EU capitals, about transatlantic relations, because this really, from an EU perspective, is a cornerstone of EU foreign policy in general, but also of the EU's policy towards the East. So none of the sides is currently willing or able to reverse the dominant trends in their relationship. This is why I assume that conflict will continue. There will be a lot of muddling through, and economic relations will continue as well, of course. And there will be small cooperative elements here and there, but the overall the overall situation will be conflict. Do I still have time for some words about Germany, or would you like me to stop here?
Maybe,
okay, then I'll stop here.
I can maybe ask you about Germany afterwards.
That's fine.
Okay, Alexander.
Oh, thank you. First, before I come to Russia and China, I must warn you that first I'm wired. And I think, so when please note it when you ask your questions. It probably goes to the US government directly. I don't know which head, because it has many heads at the moment. But also my friends from the Russian embassy told me that Russian hackers were going to hack the system. So.
And I told him they don't need to hack it because it's all going to be on the website anyway.
All right. Well, anyway. So the military exercises, or like huge military exercises in Russia earlier this month, which called Vostok 2018, which are equal only to the Zapad or West 1981, the last big exercises in the Soviet Union, caused a lot of questions and commentaries on Russian-Chinese relations and whether Russian-Chinese threat is growing to the so-called liberal international order. Well, there are actually two positions in observations or commentaries in the West that I can follow. First is that I would say it's a position of optical illusion. The people who say that nothing actually happens, we heard some opinions like that even today, that Russia and China are not even coming together because there's a lot of differences. So they are bound somehow to be enemies, at least at some point. And another position is that there is an alliance already, a working alliance or de facto alliance, and it's a great threat to the international order. So both positions actually justify the policy of the United States and its allies. The first serves the interests of those who advocate a military buildup and increased defense spending to counter an imaginary military threat. Well, is it a threat? First of all, liberal international order is, of course, a myth. I thought before that only I had this opinion, but I think Graham Ellison also wrote an article on that. It is a myth. It looks like communism. You know, it's not the system that really exists, but the one that should exist. And to achieve this aim, a lot of people should die, or have to die. So if we think about the liberal international order as the kind of system where the United States dominates the world, kind of unipolar world that was kind of coming into existence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then history, it seemed that history did not stop, did not finish, but it continued somehow, and in a not very positive way for the United States. So from that point of view, it probably is a threat. But if we are talking about the world of equals, a system of free independent countries, and liberalism, I think, comes from the word freedom, kind of. So I wouldn't call it a threat to such kind of world. And the second position, that there is no real rapprochement, justifies leveling sanctions and trade pressure against both countries simultaneously, arguing that such an approach does not impel the two countries to form an anti-US alliance. In fact, the Russian-Chinese rapprochement started in the quite some time ago, last years of the Soviet Union, from normalization, Gorbachev's visit to China in 1989, and it continued steadily, now coming to a level what is officially called the strategic cooperation. So this shows that, I mean, several leaders changed in China over that time. In Russia, even political system changed. But it did not really influence the tendency in the bilateral relations. So this shows that there is kind of objective basis for it. And what is this basis? I would say that this is common interests. We share more and more interests with China. We don't share ideology. I don't even know if Russia has an ideology. According to constitution, it shouldn't. China probably has, but nobody believes in it. So we're very pragmatic. We're talking about interests. So what are those interests? Russia and China share their vision of how the world should operate. And this vision is very different from that of the United States. Sometimes we call it multipolarity, but generally it's a world where all countries are equal and there is a right to independence. The United States, for example, does not understand what an independent country is. And from that point of view, we'll never agree on anything. Well, on anything fundamental, I would say. Of course, there may be some minor agreements. Another thing is that both Russia and China stand for preserving the system of international law as it was created after the Second World War, and the leading role of the Security Council, for example. And this is very understandable because both Russia and China are the only non-Western countries or non-American allies among the permanent members, and the veto power gives them kind of equal standing with the West. So from that point of view, by the way, it's not Russia and China that are challenging the world order. They're conservative powers. The revolutionary power is the United States when it tries to undermine the existing system of international law. Another thing that Russia and China share their approaches to most regional conflicts like Iraq, Syria, Libya, Korean Peninsula, Iranian nuclear issue, and others. And also, Russia and China cooperate economically. China is already about 7 years, I think from 2010, is the first Russian trading partner. And we don't have trade deficit, by the way. The role of Russia in China's foreign trade is not that big. It's like 10 or less, about 10%. But at the same time, it's about 2%. But at the same time, China buys from Russia some commodities that it cannot buy from other countries. Well, like military equipment, arms, with your help. Thank you very much for that. And other things like raw materials, for example. It cannot buy enough, and also there's a plan in China, a strategy of diversifying sources. So Russia is one of the countries of kind of directions of the diversification of sources. Russia and China have developed an extensive infrastructure of cooperation. Not many people know about it. From annual summits between senior leaders to numerous intergovernmental committees, and to the very lower grassroots level. I don't know now you can hardly find any region in Russia, any university, any factory that would not have direct or sister relations with some kind of Chinese partners. Neither Russia nor China has such a system of relationship with any other countries. This is important. Many foreign observers spread myths about Russian-Chinese relations in an attempt to bring the two into conflict or somehow deny the reality of their rapprochement. Even Russia and China have such detractors, mostly people who dislike their governments, either pro-Western or extremely anti-Western, who see enemies everywhere. But those forces are kind of marginal and don't really influence the mainstream foreign policy. Well, the most widespread myths there are several the most widespread myths. One is that Russia and China have, one is like, I would say, migration or even demographic expansion of China into the Russian Far East. This is a complete myth, because if anybody goes to the Russian Far East, it is possible to see that there are much less Chinese there than in Russia, and certainly much less than in Washington or New York. And generally Chinese, even in the northern northeastern part that borders Russia, they prefer go not to the north but to settle down, but to the southern China, because in southern China the living conditions are much better than in Russia. Another myth is that Russia and China somehow collide in Central Asia, and they're inevitably going into conflict there. While in fact Russia and China cooperate in this region within Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we also have an agreement between Eurasian Economic Union, of linkage between Eurasian Economic Union and Silk Road Economic Belt Initiative, and there is a treaty now between not between Russia and China, but between the Union and China. Most people most people in Russia think that the influence, policymakers, I would say, in Russia think that Chinese influence in Central Asia is much more positive. Well, first, it's inevitable. So, as you say here, if you can't beat them, join them. But also, it is much positive because China does not have any political demands, and it's a secular influence. It improves the economy without any political conditions, and this is stable because it can create a base for fighting terrorist threat or Islamic terrorist threat coming from this region, while the United States policies can create here such a mess as it did in Libya or Iraq, for example, and it would not be welcomed by either Russia or China. There's another myth that Russia might or even already turned into a client of China because of mere size of Chinese economy, that China is becoming an elder brother. By the way, in Chinese there is no There's no word for brother. There are only elder brother and younger brother. So brotherly relations would be relations between younger brother and elder brother. So I have a younger brother, so sometimes I tell him how we're going to share this, like brothers or equally. Right. So, well, of course, it's an unwelcomed phenomenon that Russia is not developing as fast as China. We are very ashamed of it and, you know, trying to do something about it, but that's another story. I've heard about it in the morning. But even if the gap widens, it does not necessarily mean that China will be a threat. For example, Canada is not afraid of the United States, or is it? I'm not sure at the moment. Well, not in a serious way, I guess. Or Belgium is not afraid of France. Oh, what do you think? Maybe not, no? Right. All right, so it all depends on the nature of relationship, you see, and if the trust is there, if relations are good, it does mean that China is going to be a threat. It's kind of, I would say, a racial thing, thinking about China that it, by default, is going to be a kind of aggressive country. Although China has never been that much aggressive in history. There's the only country in the world which has a saying that a good guy will never join the army. Well, that's traditional Chinese proverb, I would say. So, this trend, I think, of rapprochement will continue, thanks in large part to the extremely hostile approach the United States has taken toward both countries. This is not about President Trump or any other personality. Trump is only a symbol of the larger situation. The United States has long been accustomed to profiting from its global economic dominance, but its influence is declining, even as the relative influence of other centers of power, including Russia and China, is growing. So Washington finds it especially irritating that the collapse of the Soviet Union did not mark the end of history and the ultimate triumph of the United States, but only the start of a new and far less advantageous global development. In an effort to maintain its position in the world, the United States continues to behave like a hegemon and becomes increasingly embittered by the resistance that it encounters. Although its style might change after the change of government, the substance of the US policy will probably remain constant until Washington learns to live in a world that it does not fully control. The current period in which the US must learn painful lessons in the school of multipolarity, I would say, will be particularly dangerous for us, but we have to survive somehow. And Russia and China are the main instructors in this school, a role that strengthens the bonds between them. This rapprochement, however, is unlikely to lead to a formal alliance. Russia and China had historically a formal alliance 3 times. In the beginning of the 20th century, 1945 and 1950, and they all failed. So I think that Russia and China are just too big to have such kind of commitments. So what is the role of US pressure? In response to anti-Western sanctions, Russia granted Chinese investors, for example, access to energy sector. It sold to China the most advanced weapons, and which it was hesitant to sell before that. The devaluation of the ruble after the events in Ukraine contributed to the growth of Russian non-energy exports to China. So, for example, there's a good example that Trump's tariffs and Chinese countermeasures led to China's search for alternative supplies of agricultural products such as soy. And as a result, China might begin importing more from Russia, and Russia has some soy in the Russian Far East, and maybe investing in soybean production in the Russian Far East. So there are many examples like that exist. So my conclusion is that Russia and China would have continued improving relations even in the absence of the outside pressure. But the sanctions and tariffs are actually serving to accelerate and deepen this rapprochement. And that's why the interest to those who study Russian-Chinese relations is growing. And for this kind of policy, I thank this country and its allies very much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's great to be back in Georgetown. I know it's a week of homecoming, and to me, it's a little of my own homecoming. So it's great to be back. Thanks for having me. Well, I feel that listening to my colleague about the bright picture of Russian-Chinese relations, I thought that my presentation is going to be more grotesque, probably. And I frequently tell this anecdote about the three pals ending up in the tunnel, and one of them is an optimist saying there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Another one saying, no, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And the third guy says, guys, I hate to interfere in your conversation, but there's a train coming back at a high speed. So I find that Russian foreign policy in the Middle East is about these trains coming from behind at a high speed, just as Moscow is trying to discern the light at the end of the tunnel. This week will be a third anniversary of the Russian campaign in Syria. And I would start with the proposition that over the 3 years of its campaign in Syria, Russia has achieved most, if not all, of the goals it initially set for itself there. In that major terrorist groups have been damaged, if not fully disbanded, even though the problem of so-called ISIS returnees remains challenging. It is not the major challenge. It is more of the domestic radicalization is more of a problem than the return of ISIS fighters back to Russia. Opposition groups have been softened, and Assad government is stable to the point where it is pretty much safe from falling, and the Syrian army is now more combat capable than it was when Russia interfered, never mind the recent downing of the Russian plane. Third, Russian position in the region is stronger today, and Moscow is frequently consulted, listened to, wanted as a moderator, even feared. But then, of course, one may argue there is a big other side to that, where a lot of the local elites are flocking Moscow to, in order to get their own interests satisfied and not so much, provide something to Moscow, and that's, always a hard choice when you deal with the states in the Middle East and with the elites in the Middle East. Fourth, Russia gradually fills in the niches in the regional markets, be it arms exports, agricultural exports, energy deals. And these niches are being increasingly filled by Russian companies and the Russian government. And finally, well, not to mention, of course, the results of the military reform that have been tested throughout this campaign with new arms and strategies and tactics and military personnel. And finally, I think Russia eventually broke through the Western isolation that followed after 2014, and that now more European nations, let alone Middle Eastern states, are trying to engage Moscow on a lot of these regional issues. Now, as we're looking to few next years of President Putin's presidency, the opportunities lane is to try to monetize and capitalize upon these achievements. At the same time, the major challenge that remains there is to first try to figure out what I call the formula of a sufficient presence, where this kind of the situation where you don't want to dominate the region simply because you don't really have any resources, and I would argue not even appetite to do that. But at the same time, you are there, and you have high expectations, and a lot of the local players have high expectations for you as kind of a new. I don't like the term new sheriff in town because I think it's ultimately wrong. But they are looking up to you as a new offshore balancer that provides some hedging opportunities for the states in the region, and that have been seeking some leeway from the United States for different reasons. Now we're talking about challenges, and I mean the challenge of fighting this formula of sufficient presence in itself is big because it requires understanding how far you're prepared to go, what the ultimate national interest in the region is, how much you are ready to sacrifice to achieve this national interest, and things like this. But when we're talking about specific issues, there are few that are immediately on the Russian agenda requiring urgent action. One is, of course, Idlib, something that's been there for quite a while. The deal that Putin and Erdogan negotiated, is a perfect reflection of the saying on the politics is the art of the possible, and I think the two parties negotiated as much as they could in the given circumstances, and it gives some time. It doesn't really solve the issue, but it delays it to some point, and then while the two are trying to figure out what the best way to deal with this would be. Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations once argued that Turkey may be an ally of the United States, but it's not a partner. And I think in case of Russia, it's the other way around. Turkey is not an ally, but it definitely is a partner. And that kind of, once Moscow and Ankara survived the stress test following the downing of the Russian plane, they have tried to invest this experience into the deal in Idlib. And I think so far they've showed they're able to survive this stress test. Another stress test, however, which is I personally am worried about how it's going to turn out, is the relationship with Israel in the context of latest developments of the downing of the Russian Il-20 plane. You may have heard earlier today the Russian Defense Ministry made an announcement. It'll be stationing S-300 in Syria and will increase its capabilities on jamming everything that flies over Syria. So there is a debate because in the Russian military they say it doesn't really mean the skies over Syria are going to be sealed, and the Israeli defense says it exactly what it means. So we'll see how it plays out in the future within the next few days. It appears to me there are some domestic arguments between the Kremlin and the foreign ministry and the defense ministry. I feel that as President Putin tried to play it down in a way, making a clear distinction that what happened recently with the playing over what Russian defense ministry sees as an Israeli provocation is different from what was in November of 2015 when Turkey downed the Russian military jet. And then you thought, the crisis was kind of fading away up until the point where the defense ministry presented their own findings in the inquiry that they said they did, was saying that they discovered that Israeli military indeed was unfriendly. They didn't appreciate the relationship with Moscow that they were having, and they basically covered up something that came up about 2 hours ago, that the defense minister said there is a new data coming from Russia's S-400 radars saying that the Israeli plane was indeed covered up by the Russian plane. So that is a big problem that just popped up and I think that's it tells you a lot about the so-called black swans in the Middle East. You don't really expect them, but then when they happen. At the same time, I would say the way so far the relationship with Israel has been managed, as well as much as with Turkey and Iran, which I'm going to speak about in a minute, actually gives you this idea that the qualitatively different relationship with major regional stakeholders is one of the positive side effects for Moscow in its Syria campaign. Because before, it did not have the level of relationship with any of the regional powers, before in 2015, and now it does, and it, in a way, makes things easier to work with them, but on the other hand, as we've seen with Turkey, with Israel, and with Iran, there are a lot more complication because Russia inserted itself into the region where regional powers have their own genuine interests, and then Moscow trying to square. On Israel, I would finish by saying that one of the strong elements in the toolbox of the Russian foreign policy in the Middle East was this capability of Moscow to work and engage with different players throughout political spectrums across the border. And it is very interesting to see how it will now be able to manage the relationship with Israel, because the move on the S-300 and this harsh rhetoric is seemingly tipping the balance to one side against the other, which would kind of in a way go against the principle of trying to keep the balanced relationship with every power. On Iran, really quickly, I would say the notion of Moscow and Tehran having strategic alliance, I find it problematic. I do think it is strategic in that Russia and Iran have a lot more to cooperate on outside Syria. Russia is looking to Iran as a partner in Afghanistan and the Caspian issue, on battling Salafi radicalism in the Middle East. But on the other hand, it is definitely not an alliance, and I think it is not an alliance for the better, because it'll then put Moscow in the box of Iranian agenda, which it shouldn't be entirely sharing. But it definitely is appearing to be a strategic partnership, both parties trying to invest in and develop, and we'll see how that ends. Another major problem, I think, at this point for Russia is the relationship with the United States and American military presence, especially to the east of Euphrates. It is there, and this cannot be solved militarily. I think there was this attempt to test, this opportunity in February earlier this year. In Deir ez-Zor, it didn't end up well. So there should be other recipes for dealing with this issue, which I think are not at the table at this point. For Moscow and the United States, I feel that there were basically 3 C's throughout these years of Russian presence: confrontation, cooperation, and coordination. Now, I know that my American colleagues are joking when I mention this concept of 3 C's and say, well, there's also a 4th C, collusion. Sadly, I think there is no collusion between Russia and the United States in Syria, because if there were, maybe things would have been settled differently. At the same time, there is still this 4th C, and this is collision. And the risk of an unintended clash, which just happened with the Israelis, remains high, given the Russian and American military operating on a very restricted terrain. So in the context of the situation where confrontation is likely to be growing, and there is no real appetite for cooperation as the two parties, given the political constraints, given the objective difference on the nature of interests in Syria and broader in the Middle East. And so there is basically one viable option to continue invest into coordination to avoid collision. And that's where I'd probably end at this point. And
Thank you very much, Mikhail.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thank you all for coming and for staying for so long. So what is actually going on in Russian foreign policy? Well, Russia is apparently navigating the rough waters of conflict with the United States and some of its allies. And indeed, conflict with a group of major nations is costly, if at all sustainable. And we've been discussing some aspects of the image of Russia's future today from both the economic perspective and domestic politics perspective. But I think from a foreign policy perspective, we can hardly imagine Russia's future and its eventual role in the world under such conflict. Now, if we take the United States, a better relationship with Russia is not vital for the United States, but is still desirable. And we saw that every US administration since 1990, 1991, tried to reset relations with Russia. And even now, the Trump administration is not giving up on that goal, even if, unlike the Obama administration, the Trump administration can be expected to step up pressure on Russia unexpectedly and dramatically. And at the same time, unwinding this conflict between the United States and Russia, of course, looks like a very long shot or fool's errand. You pick whatever you prefer. However, think about, and that's what I always do, think about early and mid-2011. Okay, that was a time, and here I quote a high-ranking US official whom I had a chance to talk to in June 2011. The Russian foreign minister was highly regarded and welcome on the Hill, June 2011. So this gives me, this makes me think that diffusing the conflict may be within reach if there's enough political will. So, so the two key questions that I'm asking when it comes to US-Russia relations and Russian foreign policy more generally are, first, why Russia has not so far been very keen to reduce the costs and uncertainty associated with protracted conflict, and second, under what conditions the United States political system could theoretically become amenable to de-escalation with Russia. So let us look at the Russia question first. And my answer to this Russian foreign policy question boils down to Russia's concern, even preoccupation with status as a fungible currency that many believe can help resolve almost any problem, any contentious issue in your relations with the outside world. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So imagine you are facing a challenge. For example, you do not like the prospect of a major military bloc enlarging to include your neighbors. And you have two options. You basically can engage in an issue-specific negotiation about that enlargement, a kind of a give and take, or you can try and assert some privilege that would imply that you have the right to have the matter resolved to your satisfaction without give and take, without any issue-specific negotiation, just because that's kind of a situation of vertical submission that you have somewhere, like in a firm, for example. Okay, and so this second option is based on status, your recognized position in a certain hierarchy. And of course, high position in a hierarchy implies your right to have problems solved your way. What is permissible for Jupiter is not permissible for a bull, right? So perhaps instead of negotiating, you can try and assert your status and then simply see the problem off. Okay, so what I'm getting at is that it may be more attractive to achieve a higher status and get the matter resolved by default rather than to negotiate and compromise. Okay, but how do you claim and achieve this higher status? Now, usually you can claim a higher status on the basis of power and or virtue. For example, you can have nuclear weapons, and you can have a record of contributing significantly to protection of human rights on the global scale. And then, if you've got all of that, then others will, A, not mess with you, because you have nuclear weapons, all right? And at the same time, they will respect your position in a debate on whether to intervene in a certain nation state where rights are being grossly abused. So usually to elevate your status, you need to be strong, smart, and nice all at the same time. Now, if we look at Russian foreign policy through the lens of choice between issue-specific negotiation and status elevation, then until a certain point in time, Moscow was trying to negotiate on specific issues, such as NATO enlargement or missile defense, to take the two that I think somehow stir up minds in Moscow for the most, for some reason. And for example, Boris Yeltsin was very status conscious, as these recently released Yeltsin administration archives show. But at the same time, Yeltsin, as well as Vladimir Putin in his early years, were not averse to issue-specific negotiation. For example, Yeltsin negotiated meticulously with Bill Clinton of the United States on NATO enlargement and missile defense throughout the 1990s. And then Putin negotiated a new arms control treaty with the United States and also negotiated conflicts ending or potential ways to end conflicts in post-Soviet Eurasia between 2001 and 2004. But at a certain point, those negotiations broke down. Apparently, sometime around 2005 or 2006. Russia was clearly not going to get what it wanted from NATO and the United States. And from that time on, I would look at Russian foreign policy as a quest for status that is good for addressing a whole range of issues at once, instead of negotiating each one of them separately and painfully. Okay, so Russia needed to convince others that it has enough power to claim a higher status. And for that, it engaged in risky maneuvers in Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, cyberspace, other areas. And once you've embarked on a status elevation gamble, you cannot back off, because that would result in your status falling far below the level where it was when you started the gamble. And so if the status you are looking for is denied, then you have to escalate. And under such dynamic, it is difficult to settle, right? Because a specific settlement would be give and take, and for just one issue, while you want to achieve unconditional resolution of a number of issues to your satisfaction. Okay, now that's the Russia part of the picture. Now, what are the main obstacles to improving relations with Russia from the perspective of the United States? And of course, we have got Ukraine, we have got chemical weapons, but for the United States, the core issue that apparently needs to be addressed is election interference. So we cannot unwind anything in US-Russia relations, apparently, before we come to an agreed narrative about what actually happened in 2016, and then commit not to engage in state-sponsored operations with the goal of helping a specific candidate, of undermining social cohesion, or fostering regime change. And the United States, and that's my assessment, shared by a few other analysts, I believe the United States is not going to budge without such negotiation. But what gives me hope is that such issue-specific negotiation may not be a great problem for Russia, either because basically because it would not negatively affect Russia's quest and claims for status. It could instead allow Russia to unlock certain solutions solutions to the status problem once the main current obstacle is removed. And that current obstacle is the absence of a common narrative on what actually happened during the presidential election here of 2016. And of course, acknowledgement by Russia of some facts would be necessary from my perspective, as well as kind of a mutual pledge not to do not to repeat that kind of situation, okay, and not to retaliate for what has already happened. And the subject of such negotiation would, from my perspective, would only need to be targeted surprise operations, and interference should be defined in narrow terms. So for the purposes of such negotiation, you cannot include support for the civil society, for the media, and other indirect forms of influence under this rubric of interference. Okay, to agree not to do all of that, not to support, mutual civil societies, media, not to broadcast on each other what, each other feels, needs to be broadcast. To agree not to do all of that would be impossible. So such a broad negotiation would be counterproductive. But a narrow definition could make interference negotiation rather than a unilateral declaration by Russia, which I think is currently being demanded by the United States, would be attractive to the United States. So the United States could probably accept, under such narrow definition of interference, some kind of negotiation ushering in a bilateral declaration committing both sides not to interfere in each other's elections. And the sooner such negotiations begin, the better it can be, at least for Russia. Well, Moscow may want to wait for the Mueller report and then try and negotiate with the Trump administration without a delay for at least two reasons. First, the next administration, post-Trump, may be more difficult to deal with if key disputes are not sorted out before the next administration comes in. And second, the Trump administration may even not want Russia's very open confession to what, because such a confession could be politically sensitive. So Russia should probably take that chance. And such negotiation would alleviate at least some of the concerns about the United States trying to orchestrate regime change in Russia, and possibly open up avenues to going back to give and take, to issue-specific negotiation on other issues of concern to both Russia and the United States. So that would be my suggestion for a pathway towards de-escalation, towards unwinding the conflict between Russia and the United States at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting suggestion. The question is, how would you police that? I mean, you can sign a declaration that neither side will interfere in each other's election, but as we say, the proof is in the pudding. I mean, how will you know that that's not happening? Or you'd really only know post facto. So how is this enforceable?
Well, should I go in?
Yeah, no,
okay.
please. Yeah.
Well, I mean, of course, there's a difference between enforcing or even monitoring this kind of arrangement based on a bilateral declaration and, let's say, monitoring the implementation of New START, right? But I mean, as long as there's mutual will or enough political will on both sides to sort of move ahead and take that issue off the table, I think you need to make, of course, you need not intervene into sort of each other's elections anymore, but in order to move sort of beyond that, in order to kind of give Russia credit, and perhaps for Russia to give credit to the United States for not doing something that Russia doesn't want, you need to come up with a certain declaration which kind of draws the line. And of course, if both sides or one of the sides keep concluding that interference actually continues and still takes place, then it's going to unravel. But I think that's going to be the case with almost any agreement, including the New START.
May I say something?
Yeah, okay.
Well, I don't believe that the United States is going to sign anything like that in the first place, because the United States is a young country, and as any young country, it's kind of a bit nervous about its sovereignty. Well, as some people may know, my father was the first Russian, after Soviet Russian, ambassador to this country. And I'll tell you a story. One of the first things he wanted to do is he talked to your intelligence people, and he said, asked if it was possible to come to some kind of at least verbal agreement that we don't spy against each other. And they said, of course, no. That's out of question. Of course, we are friends, and you are a democratic country, and we are going to help you, but not that. You know, that's what I call that when I said that, that in this country they don't understand what equality is. Because equality is not only others' commitment, it's yours commitment as well to something.
As they say, espionage is the second oldest profession.
Yeah, but there is such an agreement with European allies, for NATO allies, but it doesn't always work as well.
Okay, we won't go down that path.
You know this Belgium case.
We've had we've had 4 very interesting presentations, a lot of food for thought, and we have some time for questions. So again, if you have a question, if you could identify yourself and also identify the person to whom you're asking your question. You look out here. What? Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for this panel. My name is Li Yang. I just thought the globe is getting smaller, people can get along with each other. But somehow I feel there's a failure by design. Within the United States, you know, just capitalism is a failure. And in France, there is also said to be a failure. But somehow communism, they are trying to improve something, they try to fight corruption, but the United States is not. But somehow in the United States, you want to negotiate with the Russian, with the Chinese, but now you're getting more longer fight, more fight. So how are we going to improve the well-being of the global citizens, and what that means people, not like organization. So how are we going to improve the people in other countries? Let's say we have something comparative advantage, so they can share that. And the same as they have better resources, they can share with us. So how are we going to approach some better strategy, whether military or political or economic sense? How are we going to approach, and so everybody can have a benefit rather than we don't trust each other. That's the United States. You cannot trust that. You cannot ask 99% to trust 1%. And in the academic world, you can see they promote a PPP. That's basically a fraud and criminal network operation. So we must do something right so they can say, we want to learn from you, and you can share something with us.
Okay. I'm not sure that you had a question there. Unless somebody has something to say. Okay.
This was a comment. Let's take it.
It was a comment. Let's.
That's a question.
No.
Really?
All right. We're going to. Yeah. All right. There's a question. Could you sit down, please? We have another question here. Yeah.
Hi, Carl Golovin. I actually have to lay a foundation for a question I'll ask to all of you. It's sort of a black swan, maybe, that I just stumbled across a couple of weeks ago, an audio recording of a man named Benjamin Friedman, who at 71 years old gave a speech or talk at the Willard Hotel in D.C., very knowledgeably. He'd been prominent even around Woodrow Wilson and present at the Versailles talks when the Balfour Declaration was presented. The gentleman mentioned Israel, and it relates to Israel because Friedman references, and I guess this is historically recognizable, but I'd never heard of it, that there was a people called the Khazars, or the Khazar Kingdom, that existed between the Black and the Caspian Sea, maybe epicentered out of the Ukraine, that existed from 700 to 1100 AD, was dispersed by Russia. And what role is this playing in the history of the last 1,000 years of conflict, and especially the last 100, especially with now, apparently in Israel, there being a recognition that perhaps 95% of those reporting Judean ancestry are not actually genetically Semitic, but are actually Khazarian, not at all connected to the Levant, and asserting a right to even regain Ukraine as a, quote, second homeland. So the Khazar kingdom, has anyone pondered that's relevance in history?
That's quite a controversial subject. Much has been written about it. I don't know if anyone wants to address this.
Too far in history.
It was a long time ago, and it's not agreed that the version of events that you gave.
And it was not in the Ukraine, by the way. It was.
And it wasn't in Ukraine.
In the Volga
That's
region.
right. It was much further east. Okay. Yes. Question at the back.
Hi, my name is Ilary, and I study at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. So my question is related to the Balkans. What are the Russian interests related to the Balkans? Because there have been reports of increased investments, especially in Serbia, and I was wondering, how do you see that? Thank you.
Who would like to take that? Russia and the Balkans?
I'm not going to take the Balkans. It's in Europe. That's your turf.
Would you like to begin to address this?
I mean, I'm not a specialist, really. I think there are economic interests, also with a view to the Belt and Road Initiative and China becoming more prominently invested in the Balkans. And, of course, security interests and the whole discussion about NATO enlargement, etc. I mean, that basically provokes Russia to engage in one way or another in different countries in the Western Balkans. So these are the two main issues I see there.
Yeah, and obviously what we see now with the Macedonian referendum coming up and everything, it's on the NATO enlargement part, it's trying to prevent any other country from joining in that area from joining NATO. We saw that with what happened in Montenegro.
And if I may add, because I think the Macedonian case is actually very interesting, because here, I mean, Russia interfered and it completely miscalculated, and it really messed up its relations with Greece, which used to be one of the key entry points, if you like, and very sort of open towards Russia, Russian messages and positions within the European Union. So this is, I think, a very good example of Russia miscalculating the possible consequences of certain steps and measures it's taking.
Yeah. Mike?
Thank you. Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. How would you describe the strategic goals and the vital national interest of Russia in the Middle East? And what are the dangers if these goals are not defined and the interests that people think are vital are not really vital? Thank you.
Yep.
Well,
your question.
Right. We're briefly talking about these things before the panel. Well, I think initially, the narrative, the start of the Syrian campaign was that of fear for the destabilization of the region that'll create imminent security challenges to Russia's southern underbelly. And I think that narrative is not entirely incorrect, in that the destabilization of the region reprojects directly into Russia's most sensitive areas in the North Caucasus or Central Asia, for that matter. So stability and security are there. The power status, I think, is also. I mean, again, if we're talking about the concrete situation in the fall of 2015, the power status was also equally important. Not just to divert attention from Ukraine, and then again, if that's the framing of the issue, it may not be national security or strategic national interest domain. But then I think it was important in that, given the situation Russia found itself in by the fall in 2015, it was important for Moscow to break through this Western isolation and make the rest of the world, especially the Western world, understand that it matters and it is a vital player on key international security issues. Energy security, I think, is also important, as the the Russians were looking across the globe to see what can challenge their dominance in the European energy market, having to deal with potential exports from Qatar and Saudi Arabia was important. And I think if one is playing with the idea of Qatar potentially having this pipeline through Syria and Turkey to provide an alternative route for Europe, now it's no longer there, or it will be there, but with the serious Russian participation. And I think also the notion that I spoke about, building of the need to build relationship with the key regional partners. You can say that Saudi Arabia was a big spoiler for Russian national security back in the 1990s. Following the start of the Syria campaign, it's no longer there. They rolled back on the support of the elements the Russian government sees as radicals, and is now more constructive player for Russia. Whether the juice is worth the squeeze, as they say, I think it is still remains to be seen. I feel that Moscow has just started to rediscover some of the drawbacks that a bigger presence in the Middle East brings. And I think that's where my point was in the presentation. Trying to find a sufficient formula is a challenge. But I think in that respect, it actually resonates very much with what the United States wants. We really don't want to leave the region as it is, just you can't afford it, but at the same time, you really do not want to commit as much resources as you used to. And there is a need to find this kind of proper balance between challenges and opportunities.
Thank you. Other questions? Okay.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for your wonderful insights today. My name is Dinas Butners, MSFS alum and CERES program as well, and now with the American Chamber of Commerce. Speaking of a recent event, Bob Woodward's book, Fear, quotes a discussion between a senior Russian military official and Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, where the conversation turned to if a conflict in the Baltic Sea broke out, that Russia would immediately resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, otherwise known as escalate to de-escalate. Now, given today's conversation with regards to negotiations and collision and various other areas of potential conflict, is this potential threatened action credible? Or is this a opening maneuver in a negotiation to get us back to the negotiating table for the various treaties, including INF, CFE, NATO-Russia Council? Thank you for your time.
Mikhail, do you want to take that?
Yeah, well, that's been a long time debate about escalate to de-escalate in Russian military doctrine, whether it's real or not. I'm on the record writing for the Survival Journal, arguing that there's no evidence to the effect that it's real. I haven't read that particular episode in the Woodward book, so I'm not sure I can comment on it, in a very precise way. But well, apparently Russia's nuclear doctrine provides for the use of nuclear weapons, for first use of nuclear weapons in certain situations. But I side with those analysts who think that the threshold is fairly high, and I would need to see the details of that conversation to be able to comment. I would only say, whether that scenario is realistic or not depends on the exact sequence of events, what actually happens. Whether they were talking about Russia's potential offensive operation, or whether they were talking about Russia's response in the Baltic to something that is happening in other theaters. So it's really difficult to comment. But overall, I would say Russia's nuclear use posture is quite conservative, and I don't see any evidence, serious evidence. From what I have access to, and this is basically only open sources, I don't see any evidence there of Russia actually seriously considering, this kind of light first use of nuclear weapons.
I think maybe I will ask you the question briefly about Germany and German-Russian relations. As you know, a couple of years ago, an article came out on German-Russian relations called From Ostpolitik to Frostpolitik. So is it still Frostpolitik, or is it something different?
Well, I think, what happened in Germany and what happened in German-Russian relations in many ways reflects what I talked about with a view to EU-Russia relations. So it used to be extremely dense. It still is dense, Politically it's strained, but then you still have a lot of economic interaction. You have a lot of contacts between societies. This is something which is probably, exceptional even in the European context, the contacts between Russian and German society. And at the same time, you have a political crisis, and Germany that's going through its own crisis since 2015, which changed the political landscape, became evident in regional elections since 2016, and particularly national elections last year. So the political landscape has changed, and this makes the situation less predictable. And we have a number of overlapping foreign policy debates now, which are interlinked in a very problematic way. Our foreign minister, Maas, announced a new, he calls it Neue Europäische Ostpolitik, New European Eastern Policy, that is now being discussed, and we have a discussion about strategic autonomy because of the uncertainty regarding transatlantic relationship that I mentioned before, and of course migration, which is the single most important issue in Germany, on the political agenda in Germany now. And these linkages make things extremely complicated. So, I don't see, I don't see the German approach towards sanctions, for instance, or towards the overall policy towards Russia. I don't see change fundamentally, but it has become less predictable.
Well, when I read that Germany is now developing an America strategy for the first time, which it's never had to do before, things are changing.
But it's necessary.
Of course it is.
As sad as it is, it's necessary.
Yeah, of course it is. Okay, there's time for one more question in case anyone. Okay, sure, Andy.
Thanks. I just have a kind of a comment and to Mikhail's presentation and a question. I think to start, unraveling the knot in U.S.-Russia relations on the interference in elections, the first step would be no interference in the midterm elections coming up later this fall. That's where it has to start. And if there is significant evidence of meddling in the midterm elections, then there's going to be an uproar again, and it's only going to it will dramatically increase the pressure for more sanctions and a more antagonistic policy towards Russia. So I think it has to start there. I think the second thing that has to happen is that the Russia investigation has to end in this country, and for the near term, and for the Trump administration, he needs to be found that there's no collusion and that there's no obstruction of justice, et cetera. And that would give the Trump administration a little bit more flexibility with Russia, but not all that much. And then, but I think that the next thing would have to happen is that we actually do the sanctions. The watershed was Ukraine, and not so much Crimea as I think the Donbass. And there, the question is, do you see any political will possibly on the Russian side to resolve this? And the European side, on the American side, can this? Because this is there are so many sanctions. At least the Europeans are more clear. There's a resolution on Ukraine, sanctions will come off. For us, it's not so clear, but if there's a resolution on Ukraine, that's a positive starting point. What's the potential for that to happen?
Start off with you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. My main sort of question for this talk was why we haven't seen so far, this willingness, openness to off-ramps, so to say. And well, there's no better explanation than what is basically offered by by well-connected analysts and public officials in Russia, and that is basically that they fear regime change. That Moscow, the Kremlin fears regime change. So if you start caving in, then basically your status falls dramatically, and then anything is possible with Russia, and then you are in for regime change. So, and that sort of led me to suggest this strategy of unwinding this situation, beginning from, as you seem to concur, the interference issue in resolving or removing at least the interference issue from the top of the agenda. And then I believe we may see the willingness on both sides, including the Europeans and the Ukrainians, to deal with the Donbass issue once this regime change thing is settled. And we are hearing now kind of the same debate with regards to North Korea, whether the United States is out to change regime in North Korea or not. And of course, there's no comparison between these two situations, but it still gives us a peak, it still gives us a view, so to say, of how that debate can go on within the U.S. bureaucracy and what compromises, there can be issued at the official level.
Sabine.
Yeah, on political will in Russia to solve the conflict, I think there is a political will, but to solve the conflict on conditions that neither Ukraine nor Western actors can agree on, and that's where we are. And this is, I think, perfectly illustrated in the discussion on a UN or UN-mandated mission in eastern Ukraine. There is no consensus, and there is practically no overlap between the positions. And I think we have many such discussions ahead of us until at some point, there will be a solution of the conflict. On sanctions, I just wanted to make a short comment. From a European perspective, the change in the US approach towards sanctions is extremely problematic. Not only because the US stopped coordinating across the Atlantic, or European business interests may be affected by US sanctions, but also, and perhaps most importantly, because the broad punitive approach that mixes up everything basically weakens not only US sanctions, but also European sanctions in their impact on specific situations, on specific policies in Ukraine or elsewhere. I think this is very, very difficult.
And of course, so many of the American sanctions now have nothing to do with Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So even if the Ukraine issue were resolved, there are all these other sanctions that are now, as we already heard today, enshrined in congressional law and are extremely difficult to lift. Before I ask you to thank the panelists, I want to thank the two people without whom this conference would not have been possible, and that's Ali Freeman and Jesse Mitchell. Thank you very much.